The men at the trading post had opinions about it, and they were not quiet opinions. Word had reached Garnet Creek the way word always reached a small settlement, through the slow accumulation of sightings and second-hand accounts, until the thing itself almost didn't matter anymore, and only the talking about it did. What people had seen, or heard from someone who had seen, was Eli Granted making trip after trip up the eastern slope of the ridge above his homestead, carrying wool and firewood and rope and canvas and a small iron stove on a sled, all of it disappearing into the shallow cave that opened in the sandstone face about 200 feet above the valley floor. His daughter Nessa, who was 11, made most of the trips beside him. Their dog went where Nessa went. Nobody could work out what he was planning to do with any of it. The most charitable interpretation, offered by a rancher named Aldous Pell, who had known Eli for 6 years and considered him a sound man in most respects, was that he was building a winter cache, a place to store meat and supplies where the cold would keep them and the bears, and the distance from the cabin would discourage anyone inclined to help themselves. That was a thing people did. It was unusual to haul that much wool to a meat cache, but perhaps Eli had his reasons, and Aldous was willing to extend the benefit of the doubt. The less charitable interpretation, which was the one that got repeated more often because it was more interesting, was that Eli Granted had not been entirely right in his mind since his wife Maren died the previous February, and that grief had expressed itself in the particular form of a grown man dragging his daughter's winter existence up a mountainside to sleep in a hole in the rock. "A cave is where you wait out a storm," said a freight hauler named Vernon Krause, who was the loudest voice on most subjects in Garnet Creek and had made his reputation on the accuracy of his practical judgments. "It isn't where you raise a child through a Wyoming winter." Several men nodded. Nobody said it was dangerous exactly. Nobody threatened to intervene. Most settled on the explanation that grief did strange things to a person, and that Eli would come to his senses once the first cold snap reminded him what a cave felt like in November. Eli was not coming to his senses. He was hauling another load of pinyon pine up the slope. To understand why, you had to understand the winter before. Eli Granted had come to the Garnet Creek Valley 8 years earlier with Maren and a good reputation as a careful man, the kind who chinked his walls twice and split his wood in June and did not wait for October to tell him what he should have done in August. He had built a sound cabin, as cabins in that country went. Log walls, tight construction, a proper stone chimney, a stove that drew well. He had been proud of it, in the modest way of a man who has built something with his hands and knows the work is honest. Then came the winter of 1891. It began ordinarily enough, and then in January it stopped being ordinary. The cold that settled into the Garnet Creek Valley in the second week of that month was not the cold of a bad week. It was the cold of a bad season, the kind that came down from the northern ranges and simply stayed, day after day, the thermometer refusing to climb past zero, even at midday, the nights driving down to places the thermometer barely reached. The cabin walls wept moisture on the inside. The chinking shrank in the sustained cold and let thin fingers of air through gaps that had been solid in October. The floor pulled heat from boots and bedding and bare feet with the patient indifference of the ground itself, which was frozen solid a foot down and did not care about the fire burning above it. Maren began coughing in late January. By February, she could not sit upright without help. By the end of February, she was gone. Eli never said directly that the cabin had killed her. He was not a man who expressed things that way. But in the weeks after, he began noticing everything he had once accepted without question. The way the stove burned hard all night, and the room was still cold by morning. The way moisture collected on the inner surface of the logs when the fire ran hot, damp finding damp, cold finding cold. The way the floor stayed cold no matter what you put on it, because the ground beneath it was frozen and had no interest in warming for anyone's sake. He had spent years making peace with these things as the ordinary conditions of frontier life, the accepted cost of winter in a place like this. He was no longer willing to accept them. He opened an old trapping ledger and wrote 3 words at the top of a blank page. Cold, damp, draft. Then he sat and thought about how a man defeated all 3 at once, rather than fighting each one separately and losing ground on the others while he did. The cave came to him as a memory before it came to him as a plan. He had sheltered in it briefly during a storm 2 springs earlier, he and the dog, waiting out a squall that came across the ridge without warning. He remembered sitting in the back of it while the storm ran hard outside, and he remembered noticing that the air in there did not feel like storm air. It felt like cave air, still, consistent. The rock around him had a temperature of its own that had nothing to do with the weather and seemed entirely uninterested in changing just because the weather had. He took a thermometer up in late September, left it in the back of the cave for a full day, while the valley below sat at 68 degrees. The cave measured 44. He went back before sunrise the following morning, when the outside temperature had dropped to 31. The cave measured 43. It had moved 1 degree while the outside world moved 37. The rock was not making heat. He understood that. The rock was refusing to change quickly. Tons of sandstone and granite, their temperature anchored to the deep earth below the frost line, could not be moved rapidly by the weather at the surface. The cold would get in eventually. But eventually was a long time, and in the gap between the storm's arrival and the cave's slow response, a man and a child could be warm. He began planning from there. The cave entrance faced southeast, which kept it out of the direct path of the prevailing northwest wind, but the opening was wider than it needed to be, and any shelter that invited the wind to walk straight through it was not a shelter. He built a vestibule across the mouth using peeled lodgepole pine, a narrow passage 4 feet deep and low enough that a person had to duck to enter. The inner and outer openings did not align. You entered from the right side of the outer frame and exited from the left side of the inner one. Wind that drove against the outer opening struck the vestibule wall and lost its direction. By the time the air reached the living space beyond, it had been turned twice and stripped of its momentum. Between the 2 openings, he hung wool curtains, 2 of them, with a gap of several inches between. The trapped air in that gap was the real insulation, not the wool itself, though wool helped. The still air held between the curtains, air that was neither inside nor outside, but in between, not moving, not exchanging heat with anything, just sitting there, refusing to participate in the cold. He packed the vestibule walls with dry grass, clay, and wool scraps. He coated the outer canvas with linseed oil and fine ash. One evening, he lit a candle in the living area and watched the flame while the wind ran outside. It barely moved. Nessa stepped through the vestibule and stopped. "The wind doesn't come inside anymore," she said. Eli tightened a lashing and said nothing. That was the point. The stove he had found in an abandoned assay cabin several miles east, a small, scarred iron box with cracked soapstone panels lining the firebox. Most men would have placed it near the entrance for easy tending. Eli placed it at the back of the cave, as far from the sleeping area as the space allowed. The heat it made would have to travel the length of the cave to reach the living space, and in traveling, it would warm the stone along the way, and the stone would hold that warmth for hours after the fire went to coals. He ran the stovepipe up through the cave ceiling, through an opening he reinforced with sheet iron and clay. He fitted a simple damper so he could slow the draft without stopping it. On the first trial burn, everything looked promising, until the next morning when he found a thin film of moisture on the stone wall directly behind the stove. Cold rock, warm air, hidden condensation. If he ignored it, the damp would find the bedding, the rust would find the metal, and eventually the mold would find everything. He moved the stove 7 inches from the wall and stacked a loose granite shield behind it with gaps at the bottom and sides, so air could rise behind the heated stone rather than pressing against it and trapping moisture between them. The next test showed a dry wall. He recorded everything in the ledger: outside temperature, inside temperature, how much wood, how long the warmth lasted after the fire went out. He wanted to know the minimum, not the maximum. Any man could burn his way through a winter if he had enough wood. The question was what the cave required when run correctly, not what it could tolerate when run carelessly. The sleeping platform he built 16 inches above the cave floor on pine poles, with dry grass and 2 layers of wool above the slats and Maron's red-striped blanket on top. The cold ground had taken enough from him. He was not going to lie down on it voluntarily. The firewood rack he built on stone anchors 14 inches above the floor. The logs stacked in open rows so air moved between them. He initially kept some wood near the entrance for convenience. 3 days of wet snow taught him not to. Moisture rushed in every time the curtain opened, and the outer logs soaked it up and burned thick and smoky and produced half the heat of dry wood. He moved the entire rack 6 feet deeper into the cave and kept only a single day's supply near the stove. These were not theories. They were failures corrected before the serious cold arrived to find them. Caleb Raw, the man whose opinion carried the most weight in Garnet Creek on practical matters, heard all of it through the trading post conversations and remained unpersuaded. A cave was where you waited to be rescued, he said again. It was not where a father made a home for a child. Eli heard this repeated to him one afternoon while loading supplies beside his mule. His hand tightened once on the lead rope and then released. He went home and inspected the stovepipe for the 3rd time that week. The valley had its opinion. The valley's opinion would not keep Nessa warm. He hauled one more load of wood up the slope as the light failed and the northern ridges disappeared behind the first serious clouds of the season, and in the cave above the valley his preparations continued in the patient, particular way of a man who has already paid the price of being unprepared and has no intention of paying it again. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from tonight. The blizzard did not announce itself. The day before it arrived, the air above Garnet Creek went strange and still in the way that serious weather sometimes announces itself through absence rather than presence. No wind. Smoke from the valley's chimneys rose in straight columns and stopped, pressed flat by something invisible overhead. The light had a quality to it that Eli could not have described precisely, but recognized without difficulty. He had grown up in this country, and he knew what that particular stillness meant. He spent the afternoon making 3 trips up the slope with the last of the split pinyon he had been seasoning since July. He already had what he calculated was enough. He brought more anyway. Nessa asked if a storm was coming. He looked at the northern ridge where the sky had taken on a yellowish-grey cast that had no business being there. "Something is," he said. They moved into the cave that evening, he and Nessa and the dog, carrying the last of the supplies they had staged at the cabin for this moment. He checked every lashing on the vestibule frame. He checked the damper. He counted the wood on the rack. He ran a candle flame along the lower edge of the inner curtain and watched for movement. Nothing. He banked a small fire and they slept. The wind arrived before dawn, not gradually. It came across the ridge at speed and struck the mountainside and the valley below with the kind of force that turned the world into a single continuous sound. In the cave, Eli heard it as a muffled roar, present but distant, the way you hear a river from the far bank. The outer curtain moved. The inner curtain did not. He checked the thermometer. 49 degrees. Outside, his best estimate put it somewhere below 0 and falling. He added 2 pieces of juniper to the coals, adjusted the damper to a position he had tested a dozen times before, and went back to the platform where Nessa was still asleep with the red striped blanket pulled to her chin and the dog pressed against her feet. He sat with his back against the cave wall and listened to the storm work itself against the mountain and find nothing to grip. Down in the valley, he knew the situation was different. He had spent 11 winters in this country, and he knew exactly what was happening in those cabins right now. The stoves burning flat out, the wood supply disappearing faster than anyone had planned for, the cold coming through the walls anyway, through the chinking that had shrunk, through the floor that was frozen solid beneath, through every gap and crack and thin place that the cold of an ordinary winter had never been sufficient to find. Families piling blankets and moving beds closer to stoves, and waking every 2 hours to feed another log to a fire that was doing everything it could and still losing ground. He knew because he had lived it. He had lived it the winter Marin died. The storm ran for 4 days. On the 3rd day, when a brief lull came in the middle of the afternoon, Aldous Pell made the climb. He was a big man, and the snow was chest-deep in places, and it took him the better part of an hour to reach the vestibule. He ducked through the outer opening, and then the inner one, the 2 curtains brushing his shoulders in succession, and he stood up inside. Nessa was sitting on the platform with a book open in her lap. The dog raised its head, decided Aldous was acceptable, and put its head back down. There was no white breath in the air, no frost on the walls. The thermometer hanging near the sleeping platform read 52 degrees. Aldous looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at the stove, which held a small, quiet fire. Then he looked at the wood rack where the logs were stacked dry and orderly, and had barely diminished from what Eli had told him was the starting amount. Then he walked to the granite shield behind the stove and pressed his palm against it. The stone was warm. "How long since you last put wood on?" he asked. "About 4 hours," Eli said. Aldous walked the perimeter of the cave the way a man assesses livestock, methodically, without hurry. He pressed his hand to the cave walls at several points. He crouched and ran his fingers along the lower edge of the curtains, checking for ice. He looked at the covered water basin and lifted the wooden lid and saw liquid water in a valley where everything above ground had frozen solid 3 days ago. He did not say much during this inspection. Aldous Pell was not a man who spoke before he had finished thinking. He sat down on the low bench Eli had built near the entrance and looked at the ledger Eli handed him. Outside temperature, inside temperature, wood consumed, fire duration. 43 nights of entries, the numbers marching down the page in Eli's careful hand. Aldous followed the columns through the worst nights of the storm. On the night the valley had gone to 26 below, the cave's sleeping area had not dropped below 47. He closed the ledger and held it in both hands for a moment without speaking. "My cabin was at 31 that same night," he said. "Stove running full." Eli said nothing. "I moved the children into the bedroom and kept the stove red all night and woke up at 31. He set the ledger on the bench beside him. "You were at 47, with a fire that had been out for how long?" "About 5 hours. Aldous looked at the cave walls, at the tons of sandstone and granite surrounding them. He was a man who understood structures because he had built them, and what he was understanding now was that the mountain itself was functioning as a wall of such mass and depth that the cold at the surface could not move it quickly enough to matter. The stove was not fighting the cold. The stone was absorbing the stove's heat and holding it with the patience of something that had been holding heat and cold for 10,000 years and was not particularly impressed by one Wyoming winter. "How much wood?" he asked. Eli showed him the charcoal marks on the stone where he had tracked each day's consumption. Aldous did the arithmetic. "I've burned 3 times that," he said quietly. On the 4th morning, the storm broke. The wind dropped, and the silence it left behind was enormous and clean. Eli went out to clear the fresh accumulation from the air intake and the stovepipe cap, work he did every morning, and he stood for a moment in the pale cold and looked down at the valley. The cabins sat in their drifts, with their chimneys putting out the heavy smoke of fires burning too hard for too long, and several of the wood stacks along the north walls of the cabins had diminished to a degree that, this early in the winter, was a serious problem. Aldous made it back down the slope and went directly to the trading post. He did not make a speech. He did not stand on anything and call for attention. He sat down at the long table where men gathered in the mornings, and he described what he had seen in plain terms, the same way he might describe the condition of a fence line or an irrigation ditch. The temperature readings, the wood consumption, the water that had not frozen. the child reading a book in her stocking feet. Vernon Krauss, the freight hauler who had made the remark about caves being places where people waited to be rescued, was at the table. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When Aldous finished, there was a silence of some length. "The rock holds the heat," Aldous said. "That's the whole thing. The rock holds it the way a clay pot holds water. The stove fills it up, and the rock spends it slowly, and by the time it's spent, the stove has filled it up again. The walls of a cabin can't do that. They're 1.5 inches of pine. There's nothing to fill." Vernon looked at his coffee for a while. "What about the moisture?" he said. "The damp?" He moved the stove out from the wall, something about letting air move behind it. "And the ventilation?" He dug out the air intake after the 3rd day when the drift came up over it. Rope around his waist, girl holding the other end inside. Vernon nodded slowly. He was a practical man, and he was doing what practical men do when the evidence arrives in a form they cannot reasonably dispute. He was updating. Over the following weeks, as the valley's wood supplies continued their faster-than-expected decline, and the winter settled in for what was becoming its longest cold stretch in a decade, the conversation shifted. Not all at once, not with any ceremony, but the question stopped being whether Eli's cave worked and became how and why it worked, which was a different question and a more useful one. Aldous moved his entire woodpile onto a raised platform before the next storm. He hung a second interior wool curtain along the north wall of his cabin. He built a small vestibule over his front door with a turned entry that required a person to change direction before reaching the door itself. He did not announce these changes, he simply made them. Vernon Krauss chinked his cabin before Christmas, a job he had been putting off since October, and added a secondary door at the entry. He bought more wool batting than he had the previous year and used it along the windward wall. Other families made smaller adjustments: raised wood storage, improved seals around doors and windows, thicker bedding positioned away from exterior walls. The changes moved through the valley the way practical knowledge moves in a place where people are paying attention to results, without attribution and without ceremony, from one pair of hands to the next. Nobody called any of it cave ideas. They just did it because it worked. Eli noticed in the spring that the conversations at the trading post had changed their character. The practical questions being asked about insulation and heat retention and wood storage were questions that had not been asked in Garnet Creek the previous spring. He said nothing about it. He was not a man who needed to be seen being right. What he needed was for Nessa to be healthy, and she was, and that was the only verdict he had ever sought from the winter. She had not coughed once. He had not written that in the ledger. Some things did not belong in a column of numbers. Some things you simply held quietly and let them be what they were. That spring, when the snow had retreated to the upper slopes and the valley was finding its feet again, Eli began the work of preparing the cave for the following winter. New canvas where the old had worn thin, lashings inspected one by one and replaced where the cold had made them brittle. The drainage channel cleared of winter debris, the stovepipe cleaned and the damper tested. Aldous rode up one afternoon with a roll of wool batting under his arm and a second roll tied to his saddlebag. He handed them through the vestibule without a great deal of preamble. "Brought enough for 2, he said. Eli looked at the 2 rolls and separated them and handed one back. Aldous took it without argument. Neither man said anything further about it. They both understood that what had passed between them over the winter was not the kind of thing that required a speech to close. The stone walls of the cave had done the talking, and the ledger had kept the record, and the child was alive and well, and all of that was more than enough. The mountain had done its part. They had done theirs. That was the whole of it. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments tonight, and tell us about a time you trusted something that others dismissed. We read every single one.